We're in this series on what would Jesus do, and we're just taking every step of the way, just looking at the life of Jesus. So it helps us make decisions on how we should get through life by knowing what Jesus actually did. And so when we say, what would Jesus do? How would you know that unless you know the life of Jesus? And so we're going to look at today, how was Jesus' first miracle a sign for us? And John, we're going to be in the book of John in chapter 2, and John talks about that this was a miraculous sign. And what's interesting is that John focuses on private conversations of Jesus. He really only covers about 20 days in the life of Jesus. He mentions like 4 Passovers. The Matthew, Mark, and Luke, those synoptic gospels only mention 1. They deal with a lot of big miracles that John never deals with. John was writing, and his of the gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, his gospel was written last, and he was writing for one main reason, was to show that Jesus was God in the flesh. And his writings are more deeper theologically than the other 3. And so it's important that we have John. And like I said, John deals with, like the miracle we're going to see today. John's the only one who talks about it. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't. John, if we didn't have John, we wouldn't know about feet washing at the Last Supper. But if we only had John, we wouldn't know about how the Last Supper was instituted and how we are to do communion. We wouldn't know all those things because that comes from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So it's important for the story of Jesus, you're always putting those together. And John's ministry primarily deals with Jerusalem. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke deal a lot with the Galilean ministry, the Perean ministry. They deal more with that than they do in Jerusalem. And so all 4 Gospels are important, but this miracle we're going to be talking about today is purely only in John. All right? And so John chapter 2, verses 1 through 2, and Jesus did about 35 miracles are recorded in the 4 Gospels. Only 7 are recorded in John. And each miracle had a purpose. And he calls them signs because they're pointing you that Jesus was the Messiah. And so Jesus did a whole lot more than 35 miracles. A whole lot more. In John chapter 20, verse 30, it talks about Jesus performed many other signs and in the presence of his disciples. And then you go down to John 21, 25, it says that we couldn't put all the things that Jesus did in this one book. And so Jesus did a whole lot more miracles than the 35 that are recorded in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, okay? So what does the Bible say? And then, like I said, he did 35 miracles, and this is chapter 2. In the NLT, it says the next day. We are still probably within the week of when Jesus was baptized. This is all happening very fast from Jesus' baptism. And it says the next day. In some of your translations, it will say the 3rd day. Okay? And you go, what is the 3rd day? Well, most people, when you read from the rabbis, they'll tell you the 3rd day is always Tuesday. In fact, Tuesday with Jews is a big day for weddings. Now, we always get married on weekends. But Tuesday is a big day for weddings with Jews. And the reason why Jews like weddings, and when you read from some rabbis, they feel like the third day was talking about Tuesday. We're not sure. But why do Jews get married on Tuesday? The reason is that's the only day of creation that God blessed doubly, twice. Jesus said it was good. And he said it twice on the third day when you look at the creation story. And so Jews go, well, Tuesday must be a good day to get married because it was blessed twice. And so the next day there was a wedding celebration in the village of Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the celebration. Now, like I said, this could be on a Tuesday. We're not sure, but it's within that first week of when Jesus was baptized. It's very quick to when a couple of the disciples went with Jesus that were John the Baptist disciples and went walking with him. That would have been Andrew and John. There is probably just 5 disciples with Jesus. And last week we looked at the first 5 that were called, Peter, Philip, Andrew, John, and John might have won his brother to the Lord. So Nathaniel would have been the Nathaniel / Bartholomew. So those would have been the 5. It's possible there were 6 there if James has gone and got his brother John and brought him on board. Remember we talked about last week when Jesus was walking along the shore and he came up to Andrew and Peter, and then he came up to James and John and told them to become fishers of men, and they left their nets and just followed Jesus. Well, that's when they walked with Jesus full time. But we see that in John, they were walking with Jesus part time. And so John, from that, you get the opinion that John knew about Jesus too, which would have been, not John, James would have known about Jesus too. And so it's possible James was here, we're not sure. But the 5 are. So just 5 of them are there. Nathaniel was from Cana, and Cana is probably 4 or 5 miles higher elevation than Nazareth. And Nathaniel was from Cana. Nathaniel might have known the people who were getting married. We're not sure about that. But we get the impression that Jesus' mother was involved with the wedding. So it could have been a family member that they're at their wedding. Jesus is invited too. And I want to say, and I say this a lot, people like being with Jesus. And I ask this, do people like being with you? It's important that we realize that people were always inviting Jesus over for dinner. People were wanting to hang out with Jesus. Everybody wanted to talk to Jesus. There had to be something gregarious about the Lord. Obviously, when he spoke about scriptures in the Old Testament, he always talked like he had authority above everybody else. So that was obviously important. But there was also people, they could have came and just talked to him about that stuff, but they wanted to hang out with him. And I always say it's important. Are people inviting you to things? Are you likable? I just think that sometimes we Christians, if we're not careful, we take on airs that we're better than other people. And it's vital that we realize we're not, and we're only saved by grace. And unless we have relationships with other people, how are we ever going to tell anybody about the Lord? And so how do you get invited more to other people's events, get invited to people's homes, get invited to go to dinner? Well, one is be a better listener. Be a better listener. Learn to be a listener. Be supportive. Realize that, we need to encourage people. If somebody said something like, man, I feel like I'm working all the time. Now, we could say, well, that's why you get paid all the big bucks. But that's not very supportive, is it? A more supportive way would be, I'm sorry that you're working so much. I know that's got to be hard on you and other people in your life. See, that's being more supportive. Following up. Someone tells you something. Somebody went on vacation? Ask them how their vacation went. Somebody had something they had to do, a big project at their job. Ask them how that was. Follow-up shows you really were listening and you care. We need to put our phone away. That's a big one. Take your phone and hide it. There's no need to have your phone out all the time. My favorite is people that wear the earpieces. It's like, are you that important and you get that many calls that you got to wear an earpiece all the time? I one time that was kind of cool, and now you just go, come on, really? Don't complain. Nobody wants to be around people that complain all the time. Don't dominate the conversation. Don't be a braggart. Don't brag. Be kind. And then don't pass judgment. There's a lot of times it's okay, just keep your mouth shut. And if you learn to do those things, you will have more people that will want to hang out with you. I just think that we as Christians need to be likable people. I remember years ago, I had a lady say to me one time, and it caught me off guard, but it's one of the biggest compliments. And she said, "You're the most conservative Christian I know. And I'm surprised how much I like you." I was like, I think that's a compliment, It's just, there's ways of being nice. And people know that you think differently than they do because we follow Scripture. And it's important for us to do that. All right, so being more friendly is important for us if we ever want to win others to the Lord. So here's our second question. What are traits that make people have more friends? Let's talk about that in your hot spots, and then come on back, and we'll continue with the story. All right, welcome back. Let's get back into our verse here. Verse 3 says, the wine supply ran out during the festivities, so Jesus' mother told him, they have no more wine. Now, this is a big deal. Today, when we have a wedding, we have these huge weddings now. It seems like they just become more and more expensive, but they're basically one night, and then the couple will go on a honeymoon someplace. In this culture, people didn't do that. They didn't, you just didn't go places for honeymoons or for vacations per se. You might go someplace to see family, but you wouldn't go on vacation. So during a wedding, for 1 week, you would be like the king and queen. They would even put on robes and crowns for the husband and wife, and people would come to the house. And for 1 week, it is a celebration. And every night there's meals and people would come. And for that week, you are the toast of the town. And most of these towns were small. So when somebody got married, everybody knew. And so it was a big deal. And it was different than you today having a honeymoon and taking off somewhere. You would stay home for the whole week. The groom was responsible for the wine. And when you ran out of wine, that was an insult that you didn't prepare, you didn't do enough preparation, and so that was a really stain on the wedding. And so Jesus' mother told him, they have no more wine. So she comes to him, and so she comes to Jesus with a problem. And it's fascinating what happens here. She just comes to Jesus. Now you got to remember, for 30 years, she goes back to when Jesus was born. She had an angel speak to her. She sat in a room and shepherds came in and told the story of an angel speaking to them and hearing a heavenly choir. A little bit later, she had some entourage from Mesopotamia came in, and they brought gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And she's just standing there. Now, she was no longer in the barn at that point, but she's hearing what these people, I followed a star right here. And so for 30 years, she's remembered that her son is going to do something. Now, it's possible because he now has disciples, part-time disciples, but it's possible that because of these part-time disciples, she thought maybe his ministry is about to begin. Maybe it's time now. I'm finally going to see what the angel was telling me about him before he was born. What's interesting here is, I just want to throw this out as a side note, Dad is not mentioned. The last time we saw Dad was when Jesus was 12 and he got lost in the temple. They left him and left Jerusalem, and he's in the temple talking, and we don't ever read of Joseph from that point on. So the thought is Joseph has passed away, because we'll see Mary in the Gospels and in John, we'll see Mary show up other places, but Dad is never there. Joseph's never there. So we assume that Joseph has passed away at this point. Now, verse 4 says, "Dear woman, that's not our problem," Jesus replied. "My time has not yet come." Now, it's interesting. He doesn't call her mom. He doesn't even call her Mary. He calls her dear woman. Now, in our culture, that would be more offensive, but this would be like in our culture saying, "Ma'am, listen, ma'am." And you still think, you called your mother ma'am, right? This is the same terminology that John used, that Jesus is on the cross, he looks down at his mother and he sees John, and he tells his mother, but he says, "Dear woman, here is John who is going to take care of you." And I'm paraphrasing there. But he uses dear woman. He never calls her mother or Mary in the Gospel of John. Now, did he call her mom at one point? Probably. When in Luke, when it talks about when Luke 2, when they came and found Jesus at the temple, Mary, we remember Joseph never speaks in scriptures. We get actions of Joseph, but he never speaks. And Mary looks at Jesus and said, "Why did you do this to me and your father?" So Mary is using the terminology, "Why did you do this to your father?" Like it was common. So I believe that when Jesus was growing up, he would call Mary mother or whatever because of the way Mary said, "Your father and I." And so, but at this point, we see he says, "Dear woman." Part of that could be now that Jesus is entering into his ministry, Mary is having to come to him like every other sinner. That's a thought. That's a thought. He is also showing his independence. He is now separated as an adult. But he says, basically, "Ma'am, that's not our problem." Then he says, Jesus replied, "My time has not yet come." In the book of John, 5 times he says, "My time has not come." Talking about the cross. He didn't want people to get stirred up too quick, because there was a process of getting him to the cross. It was going to be about 3.5 year process, and he didn't want anything to stop him on following his Father's will. 3 times he says, "My time has come. It's time for me to do something." So 8 different times he says either my time hasn't come or my time has come, and he's referring to the cross. And he's on a timetable, and he knows that. So Jesus did not want to display his power. He was not ready for people to see his power. He was there at the wedding to enjoy the wedding. I do want to just throw this in. By Jesus being at the wedding, he's basically putting his stamp of approval on marriage and on weddings and why weddings are important. I think in our culture, we have a lot of people not getting married, and it's important for we realize that weddings serve as something very important in our culture. And I just throw this out. With people who live together have a higher rate of divorce than people who do not. I mean, it's high. It's in the 70% rate of either not getting married or getting divorced when they live together first instead of just getting married. All right? So his mother told the servants, do whatever he tells you in verse 5. I love this. She goes to Jesus and he says, my time hasn't come. I'm not ready to show myself. And then she goes, okay. And she walks over to the servants and says, whatever he tells you to do, you do. She thought that, first of all, she thought her son could do something about this. Secondly, she's telling the servants to listen to Jesus. And so we see Mary had faith in Jesus. He literally had faith. Mary had faith that Jesus could fix the problem. How many times do we go through life and we're always trying to solve our own problems instead of going to prayer, going to the Lord and saying, Lord, I need your help here. Mary went to Jesus. And then verses 6 through 8 says, standing nearby were 6 stone water jars used for Jewish ceremonial washing. Each could hold 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus told the servants, fill the jars with water. Now this water is, the Jews were really big on cleaning their feet and cleaning their hands when they entered a home. It was ceremonial to be pure. And I think it's fascinating that he uses these jars of water, because what you're going to see is the Lord is going to turn water into wine versus where the water were ceremonial for washing. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes, we have looked at some of their writings, and they talk about that's why these water jars were there, was to ceremonially clean themselves. But what were you cleaning? The outside. Jesus is cleaning from the inside out, right? He's changing inside out. When the jars had been filled, he said, now dip some out and take it to the master of ceremonies. So the servants followed his instructions. So he's taken this water and he's changing it. Now we don't know when it changed into wine, but it changed into wine in this process. And Mary, the disciples, and the servants knew what had happened, but nobody else at the feast knew that a miracle had occurred. So Jesus is trying to take care of mom, but he's also trying not to make this a big deal. He's trying to keep this very, very low key. And we also see in the book of John, we see several of miracles that Jesus did, like the feeding of the 5,000, where they put mud in people's eyes to see. There's different things that Jesus did a miracle, and yet he used people to actually do things. Like the servants here actually did something. And so sometimes you think what you're doing is not that important, and yet God might just be using you, and you think in a small manner, and yet God's using you to do something even bigger. But you still have to do your part. The servants had to do what he said, fill them up and dip the water out, and that's how the wine happened. When the master of ceremonies tasted the water that was now wine, not knowing where it had come from, though of course the servants knew, he called the bridegroom over. Now, when it says the master of ceremonies, in our culture, we would say more like the Toastmaster. Sometimes in our weddings today, once once the food has started, it's the DJ becomes the Toastmaster. He goes, now we're going to have the first dance, and now we're going to cut the cake. And, somebody's doing that. That's who's talking here. And he calls the bridegroom over, and he says, a host always serves the best wine first, he said. Then when everyone has a lot to drink, he brings out the less expensive wine, but you've kept the best until now. So this miracle is showing the significance of how Jesus creates with quality, and at the same time, he provides for our needs. And so it's extremely quality that he does, all right? And so here's question 3. How do beliefs affect your decision making? How do your beliefs affect your decision making? Talk about that. They come on back. All right, the last 2 verses. Let's wrap this up. It says, this miraculous sign at Cana. Now look how he says miraculous sign. He doesn't say, look at this miracle. It is a miracle, but he's saying it's a sign. So he's pointing us to something. He says this miraculous sign at Cana in Galilee was the first time Jesus revealed his glory. Now, when it says he revealed his glory, what it's talking about, it's the first time that he did something that revealed his divinity, his godness, the God side of him. And so and then we see, and his disciples believed in him. So we see 3 things in verse 11. We see the sign, we see the glory, and then his disciples believed in him. Now they're walking with him because they got to think he's something different, but this is the first miracle that they have ever seen him do, and so their belief in him had to skyrocket because they saw something they've never seen before because he had that kind of power. And then after the wedding, he went to Capernaum for a few days with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples. In some of your translations, it will say he went down to Capernaum. And Capernaum is actually north of Cana. But when it says in your translation he went down, it's because Cana was elevated because it was in higher area, and they would go down the mountain into Capernaum. Capernaum then becomes where Jesus now builds his, he grew up most of his life in Nazareth, but now Capernaum is where it's part of an international highway, and that's where he builds his ministry. And so, how can you obey? This is what we want to remember about God. One is, Jesus has the power to transform water into wine. That shows the quality of when God creates. And the Bible tells us that Jesus was part of creation. And so when Jesus creates, he creates with quality. We also see how he takes care of our personal needs. We need to remember that. And then the second thing is we need to understand that Jesus has the power to transform your life. Doesn't matter what you've been through, what you've done, Christ has the power to change you from the inside out. That ceremonial jars, the washing, would only clean your hands on the outside or clean your feet on the outside. And here, God changes us from the inside out and makes us a different person. And it's never too late in our lives to change. All right? So I want you to think about this miracle. The Bible says this was the first miracle or miraculous sign that Jesus did. There are some Gnostic gospels out there that talk about Jesus doing miracles when he was a child. And yet, by reading the book of John, that tells us those are not true. There's some real fanciful things that have been written about Jesus in other books outside of the Bible. But John is saying, listen, this was the first time he had ever done a miracle. And it helped those 5, maybe 6 disciples realize, they're following God in the flesh. Think about that this week as we strive to become more like Christ, as we study the Bible, serve others, and share our faith together.